16 days after agents of Saudi Arabia murdered Washington Post columnist and United States resident Jamal Khashoggi at their consulate in Istanbul, the Trump administration approved the transfer of sensitive nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia. It was one of the 2 times the administration allowed U.S. energy firms to export nuclear technology and expertise to Saudi Arabia since Khashoggi's murder on October 18th of last year and also this past February. Democratic Senator Tim Kaine revealed these approvals yesterday, citing records given to Congress. Congressional staffers from both parties and an Energy Department official confirmed Kaine's account to NBC News. More than 2 months ago, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee requested details from the administration on 7 transfers of nuclear expertise to Saudi Arabia, including the timing of the approvals. On October 17th, 1 day before the initial approval, President Trump publicly defended the Saudis, saying they are, quote, a very important ally because, quote, they're a tremendous purchaser of arms and military equipment. Saudi Arabia plans to build nuclear power plants, but so far has refused to agree to safeguards to ensure it does not develop nuclear weapons. In addition, late last month, the Trump administration bypassed Congress and invoked a rarely used national emergency provision to authorize 22 separate arms sales to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Jordan. Democratic Senator Bob Menendez and Republican Senator Lindsey Graham are now teaming up to introduce 22 resolutions of disapproval in an attempt to block those deals. Joining us now, one of the sponsors of that legislation, member of the Foreign Relations Committee, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut. Senator, good to have you with us this morning. Walk us through what happened here, if you could, and what your protests against it are.
So the president and his administration act as if the Saudis are the senior partner in this relationship. And what has happened is that there has been absolutely no consequences to Saudi Arabia for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and the continued imprisonment and torture of other U.S. residents inside Saudi Arabia. And the message that we are sending to the world is one of absolute grave weakness. In fact, Saudi Arabia has been rewarded for their murder of Khashoggi because, as we now know, we have continued to approve nuclear sales to the Saudis, even though they have not agreed to what we call the gold standard of civilian nuclear activity to make sure that they don't start a nuclear weapons program. And now the president is going around Congress to sell them weapons that are going to be used to perpetuate potential war crimes in Yemen. These are the bombs we're selling them that they end up dropping on civilians inside Yemen. It's an inexplicable move by the administration. And, you know, for many of us, I think we can't understand it outside the framework of the Trump family's personal relationship with the Saudis. There's a lot of money that historically has flowed from Gulf state individuals to the Trump family fortune, to their real estate empire. And that has to be part of the explanation as to why they continue to bend over backwards to try to make the Saudis happy despite all of their malevolent activity.
Let's underline again here, twice after the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, including once 16 days after his murder, these sales were made, and again on February the 18th, about 4 months after the death of Jamal Khashoggi, transferring nuclear technology to the Saudis. So how do you explain this beyond the personal relationships? I mean, the president said it explicitly there in that quote I read a few minutes ago where he said they're a big purchaser. The reason that we are not condemning them the way we ought to be condemning them after the murder of a U.S. resident and a Washington Post journalist, frankly, is because of a business deal, perhaps like the ones we're talking about here.
Yeah, so I think there are 2 additional ways to explain it, and you hinted at one. First, the president views every foreign relationship as transactional, and so as long as you're buying things from the United States, he doesn't see any reason why your human rights record or the other things you do to contradict American national security should stand in the way of us selling you things. But, you know, we all know that there has to be a moral line that a country can cross so that we get out of business with them. You wouldn't sell your neighbor a gun gun if you knew that they were going to use that gun to kill someone in their household. And that's what we're doing with the Saudis. We're selling them weapons that we know they're going to turn around and use to kill civilians inside Yemen. But he also, went to Saudi Arabia first because he, just wanted to signal to the world that he was going to do everything different than Obama. Obama had, tried to build a relationship with Iran to disabuse them of a nuclear weapons program. That made the Saudis angry, and so that's why President Trump went first to Saudi Arabia. The problem is the president's committing nuclear non-proliferation malpractice because he's pulled out of the Iran agreement, and by selling the Saudis nuclear technology, it makes it much more likely that the Iranians are going to restart their nuclear program because they see that the Saudis have a head start. So, this is absolutely disastrous, and there's no real way to explain it through traditional national security lenses.
Senator Murphy, Elise Jordan here. Thank you for continuing to speak out against the United States selling these arms to fund a horrible war that is causing massive starvation in Yemen. We see the Saudi influence throughout the region, and I'm curious about your opinion if they are indeed emboldened right now, looking at what's happening in Sudan with 60 protesters being killed over the last few days and those widespread protests there that the Saudis are involved in. Are they more emboldened to pursue their own agenda in the region, and an agenda that could be contrary to American interest?
Well, I think that we have to ask ourselves whether it is in our national security interests to get so deeply involved in a series of unfolding proxy wars throughout the Middle East between the Saudis and the Iranians. That's what Yemen is becoming. The Iranians are bad actors, and we absolutely should have a policy of trying to stop them from expanding their influence in the region. But the Saudis are bad actors as well. Remember, the extremist groups that we continue to fight all around the world are Sunni extremist groups. They are the bedrock underneath them is a brand of Islam that Saudi Arabia exports around the world. The Saudis' human rights record is getting worse by the day, comparable to the miserable human rights record of the Iranians. And so I think it makes sense for the United States to step back here and come to the conclusion that, well, we don't want Iran to gain much more of a foothold. We also don't necessarily need to be incentivizing the Saudis to fight proxy wars around the region. I brought a disapproval motion before the Senate under the Obama administration to stop these arms sales to Saudi Arabia. I got about 20 votes for that, and I'm really glad that Senator Graham and many other Republicans are going to support us in this measure that we'll bring before the Senate in the coming weeks.
Senator Tom Nichols here. It seems to me that underlying all this, aside from the specific problem here, there's a huge separation of powers problem going on here, which is that when the president doesn't want to deal with Congress, he declares an emergency and governs by fiat. Is there any plan for dealing with this larger problem of a bipartisan problem over many years of the enlargement of executive power, but really something I think the president seems to have put on steroids?
Yeah, I talked to one Republican senator yesterday who said that they wanted a Article 1 working group where we would get together and talk about restoring our Article 1 powers. That sounded like a nice idea in theory, but we really don't have to sit down and talk about how to restore our Article 1 powers. We know how to do it. This week, we could take up legislation to stop the president's out-of-control tariff policy. The Senate Republicans could choose to restrain that power. We could easily make the decision to take away the president's power to use this emergency loophole to sell arms to the Saudis. In this case, my worry is that if the president uses some vague emergency in the Middle East in order to go around Congress to sell arms to the Saudis, normally Congress has the right to disapprove of any arms sale, then we will never weigh in on an arms sale again, because there's always some emergency somewhere in the Middle East that would allow a president to say that they can't take the time to come to Congress. So if Republicans don't step up right now on the tariff issue, on the arms sale issue, then I think you're setting a precedent whereby Congress is permanently taking itself out of the game, and you're starting to become an imperial presidency from a foreign policy standpoint, which is not what the Constitution drafters envisioned.
Senator, your colleagues in the Senate on the Republican side had a meeting on a different issue yesterday with some officials from the White House, and that is about the proposal of these tariffs on Mexico. We heard in different reporting reporting from Ted Cruz, Mitch McConnell himself saying we don't like tariffs. This is a bad idea. Senator Cruz reported to have told White House officials, go back to the White House and tell them you didn't hear a single yes from Republicans on this idea. Do you believe that this will be at least one moment where Republicans step up to the president?
Well, there were two things that happened yesterday. One, the Republicans sent this message to the presidency that he'd be in real trouble if he if he actually went forward with the Mexico tariffs. And that strategy has worked in the past. They have communicated to him that some of his nominees were so objectionable that they wouldn't find favor in the Republican caucus, and he pulled them. But then you also had Chuck Schumer, essentially telling him he didn't believe he would actually go forward with it, which caused the president to double down and back himself into a deeper corner. And so it's not clear whether the Republicans' normal tactics of trying to quietly signal to the president that he's gone too far in this case will work. And if the president calls their bluff, there's really no precedent for them actually using their Article 1 powers to stop him. Lots of complaints, but not a lot of action. So unfortunately, I think this is in the president's hands. If he moves forward with the tariffs on Mexico, I would be surprised if Republicans in the Senate actually go forward with a confrontation with him. They've never wanted one before. I'd be pleasantly surprised if they do it, but unlikely.
And again, the president said yesterday overseas Republicans would be, quote, foolish to cross him on this. Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, thanks so much for your time this morning. We appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
And in our next hour, we'll speak to Senator Tim Kaine, who yesterday revealed those Saudi deal approvals. Still ahead on Morning Joe, new reporting that Russia's effort to meddle in the 2016 election was better planned and also more lucrative than previously thought. NBC's Ken Delanian joins us with that new reporting next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.